welcome. Oh, I get a little thing in my ear here that we're ready to rock and roll here. I'm Monique Flash from the Glenview Public Library, and welcome everybody for being here today for the high school and middle school kickoff event for the Glenview Public Library's 4th annual Glenview Reads Together, this year featuring March, Book 1, a coming-of-age story of John Lewis and the Civil Rights Movement told in graphic novel format by Congressman John Lewis, Andrew Iden, and illustrator Nate Powell. Our teen program this afternoon will start with a brief presentation by illustrator Nate Powell, who will show a quote-unquote really cool PowerPoint on the process of creating a graphic novel. And we have students Reese, Lila from the Springman Middle School, and Hannah and Caroline from Glenbrook South High School, who will then proceed to interview Mr. Powell. By way of introduction, Nate Powell was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, began self-publishing his work at age 14, and then graduated college from the School of Visual Arts in 2000. He's an accomplished award-winning author and illustrator who has received many awards, including the National Book Award for Young People's Literature. His work includes the Mark Trilogy, books 1, 2, and 3, and the brand new graphic memoir essay, Save It for Later. Rick Riordan's The Lost Hero and many other titles. And he has also contributed to the just published book Run, Book 1, which continues the story of John Lewis's memoirs. So without further ado, everybody, let's welcome Nate Powell and our student interviewers. Let's go.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, it's Nate. Thanks for being here. I'm just going to burn through this slideshow as fast as I can because I think it's a lot more interesting to hear your questions and for us to talk together. I basically just made this to, basically just made this to show a little bit of the process of, here we go, view full screen. Okay, a little bit of the process of making this from a cartoonist perspective, but also like I write and draw my own books that are usually fiction, and they're usually like pretty out there and dreamy. And for those, it's like, it's really easy. Like, it's just me hanging out in my studio, listening to music and living in my imagination for a couple of years at a time, making books. And the process of doing the March trilogy is different because you're dealing with interpreting someone else's first person account to make memoir. That account is also historically accurate and significant. So you are telling graphic nonfiction history, and you have to, make sure that you're really being accurate and responsible with what you're telling. And there are just a lot of considerations when you're working together with someone else. I work almost entirely just physically with basic materials. And one thing I really love about comics as a medium is that it doesn't take a lot. It doesn't take a lot of money. It doesn't take a lot of resources. It just takes something to draw with, something to draw on, and it takes an idea. And generally, I do all my work with these tools here. Like March was done with really only like half of this stuff, just using black India ink and drawing with, wait, can you guys see my little cursor as it's moving? Okay. So using a crow quill nib pen or a watercolor brush with the black ink, and I would draw, at first using pencil with a mechanical pencil, use a couple of different white plastic erasers, and my lettering is actually mostly just done with a cheap $2 pen, like not even a pen for art or comics or anything. What's fun about making comics is that nobody really sees or pays attention to any of the steps before you're actually reading a published thing. So it's nice. Like if cheap tools work well for you and you like the way that they look, then you should use them. So when I'm lettering my books, I would try really expensive technical pens, and they just didn't look as good with my handwriting as a $2 pen I would get from a drugstore. And I use a toothbrush to make little splatter effects and textural effects, and use some white ink every once in a while to add white lines on top of things. And that's it. So getting into the process of March, especially with book one, here's the team all gathered up at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. This was just a couple of days after I finished drawing book one back in March of 2013. And so Andrew, who's there on the right, and Congressman Lewis worked for about 2 years before I came on board. Andrew actually wrote the script. They are both co-writers, but this is also interesting because while Andrew actually and technically wrote the comic and did so much of the research, Congressman Lewis not only lived the experience, but a lot of these stories throughout his life and a lot of these stories of the movement, he has been telling for decades as an oral storyteller. And so one of his most famous early life stories, which is the chicken story from March book one, we were doing a little research along the way, and Andrew found that the earliest recorded example of him telling that story was in 1961, when he was 21 years old. And so during the process of, taking a script page like this and turning it into a comics page, along the way, I had to recognize that sometimes, like Congressman Lewis had a very distinct voice in a way that he carried himself. And sometimes the actual words on the page would come out a little bit awkward. And it took me a while to realize that that's because he is a lifelong oral storyteller. And there's really, at first I would try to change and tweak some of those things until I realized that there was this sanctity to the way he was telling these stories. And I kind of had to go back and instead change the way I told the story so that we could keep his words as they were. So here's a page of script that Andrew and Congressman Lewis made. This is from the moment in March book one where young John Lewis is arrested for the very first time in front of the Woolworths in downtown Nashville. And so here you'll see that Andrew has broken it down by page and panel, kind of like a movie script. And I have some notes here on the side because I'm kind of changing the pace and changing the focus visually as I go along. If I find
Nate,
something—
can I interrupt you real fast, please?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Your pages are not advancing. It's still stuck on the first one.
They're not. All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. All right. Let's see. I'm going to just start the share screen again to see if it'll work. Okay. Can you see the script page here?
Yes.
Okay.
We see that.
Now, when I change it, do you see something else?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just going to cross my fingers and make
Okay.
see if we can make this work. So here on this page of script, one of the most important things when you're dealing with a comic is it's a visual narrative. And that doesn't just mean it's text and images together. It's the fact that a lot of the information that's in a comic is nonverbal. So it's like a lot of the details and a lot of the environment and the feeling and the context that's in the images has value as information. So don't take it for granted. So reading through the script here, there are moments where one of the main rules of comic storytelling is show, don't tell. So if you have an opportunity to communicate something without words, that's what you should do. So along the way, here in panel 2, as John Lewis and the other protesters are being arrested, the description: white protesters are led to one paddy wagon, while the black protesters are led to another. And then the caption beneath it originally was, they segregated the whites and the blacks into different vehicles, in the words of John Lewis. My note then is show, don't tell. And by simply using the power of comics to show that being done, we can then add different text over the panel, and it kind of makes it a richer read. You're seeing what John Lewis is describing while he's discussing something else. And then from there, from that page of script, now, did you guys see is the image different now? Okay, good. Next, we move on to the thumbnail stage. And basically, they're called thumbnails because each of these are super tiny. They're only like 1 or 2 inches high each. And it's just a rough, sketchy version of every page in the entire book. And the whole point is just to make sure that things flow somewhat okay, and making sure you have enough room for all of the text and the lettering, and just making sure it fits in space okay. So it's not too crowded or too loose. Now from there, I would take these thumbnails, and then do a penciled version. And I would also pencil in the lettering. And here is like, this is where I finally send it back to Congressman Lewis and to Andrew and to our editor. And we all get in the ring about things that need to be changed or what is working. And if there are any mistakes with where the text is or how it's reading, this is the time to fix it. And from there, then I would ink over the lettering in a final version. And then I would do the line art with black ink. Then I would run over it with a hairdryer to dry all the ink. And then I would like water down my black ink into gray and just do some nice simple washes over it. And in these pages, I have a little bit of pencil work and white ink too, just for different effects. But yeah, for each page of comics art, there's really 4 or 5 pages worth of work that goes back and forth between the writer and the artist. Now here we're in front of the Woolworths in Nashville. Along the way, working with Congressman Lewis to do these books, we were touring across the country for years, every weekend or every other weekend. So right after March Book 1 came out 8 years ago, we were standing downtown Nashville, maybe waiting for somebody. I can't remember what we were doing. We had some free time. And I had to learn early on to be a really mindful listener, because Congressman Lewis would start telling stories at any point. And I really, as a student, I needed to pay attention because I never knew if there was a detail I needed for the books. So here, I took this picture. It was just us and Andrew hanging out on the street. And he was like, oh, you guys see that Walgreens across the street? That actually used to be the Woolworths where I was arrested for the first time. And we're like, what? He's like, oh, yeah. Sorry, I forgot to tell you guys that. But yeah, this is where it was. And literally 10 or 15 seconds later, once he starts giving us some details, these reporters and camera people just like showed up and they're like, oh, yes, tell us more. And I was like, what is going on here? And Andrew was like, get used to it, man. This stuff happens all the time. But Congressman Lewis was just like so generous with his time. He's like, you know what, you guys, follow me. We're going to do a quick walking tour of downtown Nashville and all of the civil rights history landmarks that are here. And so then we just went on this 1.5 hour long walk through downtown Nashville. And he just gave us this private tour. And I was just like meticulously trying to take pictures and remember everything as we went. It was just a real gift. And much of March, was really inspired by this 1956 comic, Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story, about the Montgomery bus boycotts. Teenage John Lewis was exposed to this comic in his early nonviolence workshops that Jim Lawson was leading in Nashville. And through it, he was able to see the power of comics and being able to communicate these ideas and communicate what nonviolent revolution and nonviolent resistance can really mean. This comic actually has like a crazy history of its own. It was used all across the world and translated into tons of different languages for a lot of different pro-democracy and people's movements and labor movements. It's really fascinating. Are the slides still advancing, y'all? Okay, good. Here are just some panels from within that depicts during the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycotts, white supremacists bombing the King family home, which led to a crisis in the family of like, do we need to get out of town? Do we need to stay here and stick it out with the movement? Coretta Scott King and their 10-week-old baby were in the front room of the house when the bomb exploded and they were blown off their feet out of the room, which is absolutely terrifying. So being inspired by these comics myself, along the way, I was able to visit the King family home. Here on the front porch here, you'll see some people peering down at the spot where the improvised bomb exploded on the porch from that moment that was captured in the comic itself. And so whenever possible, I was able to kind of connect to the history physically in space. And it helped that I spent my elementary school years living in Montgomery, Alabama. My family's from Mississippi, and I had enough familiarity with a lot of the locations that I was able to kind of put myself in that place while I was at the drawing table. And I learned a lot of my basic civil rights education as a kid in the 80s from my parents and from growing up in Montgomery. But this is also kind of personal for me because my parents were these, white Mississippi baby boomers who grew up during the Jim Crow South in a very segregated society. And so their generation grew up with this baggage that because the civil rights movement was successful, a lot of moderate white baby boomer America wanted to move on and not reflect too much on the improvements that still needed to be pressed for in society. And so this is a picture of me on the left as a 6-year-old. And that's my mom behind me. And she, scored a chance to go to the Alabama State Capitol and get a picture with the longtime governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who, it may be noted, was a huge white supremacist and is famous for the phrase segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, in one of his inaugural speeches in 1963. I didn't know this at the time, and as I asked more questions, or as I learned about civil rights movement history as a kid, my parents and a lot of people of their generation had a lot of excuses and exceptions of like, well, that was a different time. That was way back when. This is not that. But the older I get, I'm like, man, that was just like 15 years before I was born. Like, that's not a lot of time. And 15 years passes by really quickly. And so the kind of discomfort that I have remembering these experiences of like meeting George Wallace and not understanding what he was truly responsible for and what that meant. And how my mom at the time was just excited that I got a chance to have a picture with the governor. When I got the chance to draw March, it was personally important for me to kind of push back against the way my generation was miseducated about the civil rights movement and the civil rights struggle by our parents' generation. And I don't want to take up too much more time, but we also tried to highlight the role of reporters and journalists and a free press basically as their own characters throughout these books, because without the role of reporters and camera people documenting these protests and documenting the disproportionate violence against them, a lot of this progress couldn't have occurred. It wouldn't have wound up on TV screens in people's homes throughout America. It wouldn't have made so much more of the people of the United States push for civil rights advancement without the role of these reporters. There's a famous photo by Spider Martin from Bloody Sunday in 1965 in Selma, Alabama, as Alabama state troopers and deputized white supremacists approach to assault 600 protesters. And then the next image, this is the cover of March Book 3, and way up there in the upper left-hand corner, you have the person who actually took that picture at that moment documented on the cover as a character within the book. And so it's important to understand that by reporters and camera people being there and taking risks and even taking hits themselves, we were able to get these historical moments out into the consciousness of people across America. I think,
Nate?
yeah, that does it for now. Yes.
Thank you so much for that, Nate. I think we want to get right into the interview questions.
Yeah, let's do it.
That was a great presentation. Thank you.
No problem.
All right.
Okay,
Oh.
hopefully you can hear me. I'm Caroline. I'm a junior at Glenbrook South High School. And my question is, well, some of the comics you showed throughout your presentation, some were in black and white and some were in color. So why did you choose to make your illustrations in March Book 1 black and white and compared to your cover being in color?
You bet. Well, in the world of like independent graphic novels, it's still like about half of them are done in color, about half are in black and white. But black and white is still considered like the standard approach. So it's not that in the comics world, it's not considered that unusual. But more importantly, for you and me and anyone who's born after the 1960s, the way that we relate to anything that happened before 1970 is probably in black and white. Even when I as a kid was seeing a lot of this grainy black and white footage and photography, I could go in person to a lot of these locations throughout Alabama and step in the location of history. But it was important to put the connections together. So I kind of figured, like, mentally, all of us are experiencing this history in black and white. And so maybe by keeping it in black and white, it would make it easier for all of us to sort of stay in the moment. Also, it doesn't take as much time as fully coloring a comic by hand. And there were frankly just a lot of pages and a lot of work to do. And I had to be practical about it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Lila. I'm an 8th grader at Springman Middle School. And my question for you is, how long did it take you to illustrate the entire book from the start to the published book?
All in all, it took me about 4.5 years for all 3 books. But the first book, I'd say I got started, it was about 5 months of all the inking and the lettering and actually getting the finished pages. And then before that, I spent a couple of months penciling the book and like reading John Lewis's memoirs and reading some history. So I'd say it was about 8 or 9 months total of work. But there were times in between where, like, you do the pencil version first, and then you've got to wait for about at least a month or so that, Congressman Lewis and Andrew and the editor, we've all got questions. I made mistakes, I make mistakes every day. So a lot of that is like making sure you have a list of stuff to fix when you actually go in to ink everything. So all in all, I'd say it was about 9 months of work.
Okay, hi, my name is Reese. I'm an 8th grader at Springman Middle School. And my question for you is, previously you mentioned how making this book historically accurate was very important. Did the authors give you any guidance or words of advice on how to create the illustrations?
Yes, and that's an excellent question, because on one level, I was lucky enough to have Congressman Lewis here with us. And so we'd be traveling every couple of weeks, and I'd have a chance then to ask him in person about little details or questions I would have throughout the books. And then I could speak more regularly with Andrew, who's the co-writer and who did a lot of the other research. But yes, so Congressman Lewis, John Lewis, had a really great archive of, like, the first time I ever met him, I went into his office in Congress, and just walking in, I was like, wait, is this actually his office? Because there was only like a little table that was like this big and a couple of chairs, and everything else was like framed pictures and like artifacts from the March on Washington and pieces of art. And it was like a tiny museum. And Andrew was like, yeah, man, like he's a collector. He keeps everything. He is his own archive of this history. So I was able to go straight to the source. And Andrew sent me a lot of reference material and a lot of notes of things to think about. But it also meant I had to look as I was drawing and reading. And I had to recognize that if there was something that I didn't have an answer for, or like, be like, oh, okay, if I'm drawing a scene that's on the streets of Nashville, and and I'm like, I wonder where, I wonder if this store is actually on the corner of the block, or if it's on the middle of the block, or is this a wide street, a narrow street? Little details like that can make a difference. Or like, what kind of trees grow in the central farmland of Alabama? every single one of those questions has an answer. And so it's a matter of constantly, every day, writing a little list of things you need to know. And then basically I'd spend about an hour and a half a day just doing Google image searches and trying to get answers to those little details. And for me, that was the fun part. The other part is like stuff that I never thought about before, like the kinds of shoes people wore in 1960 and the kinds of cars people were driving. But especially if you have like college students and teenagers driving cars in 1960, they're not going to be like brand new fresh cars. They're going to be cars from the 40s. And so then having to research like the old hand-me-down cars they'd be driving. A lot of that's really fun. It is a lot of work, but that's what really helps make, give an image of a complete world that is set in 1960.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Hannah, and I'm a junior at Glenbrook South High School. And so my question is, how have you found capturing like the real life moments in history different than illustrating like fictional narratives that are maybe more traditional graphic novels?
A lot of it is, it's a matter of just like being mindful that the people involved in a historical story are individuals with their own lives, their own personalities. And while I was drawing March, recognizing that some of the people who might have been named, might have been unnamed throughout the story, some of those people were still with us. They were still alive. And I needed to be mindful and respectful of the fact that they will probably read the book once it's out. A lot of people had passed away by that point, but I had to recognize that their involvement in a protest was significant and sort of treat them with a level of respect while trying to also just like tell it like it is. So a lot of that is like, it brought a lot of humanity even into smaller characters who might only be in the book for a couple of pages. And I thought that was really refreshing because like, I have to work pretty fast as a cartoonist, and I try to be sure enough about things as I'm going, and then I kind of have to just keep on going and I don't look back so that I can get the book done or get the project done. So it was kind of nice to be like, for every person who I would depict throughout this book, to really try to see them as best as I could for who they were and what their personality was like. And that was really fun because sometimes that meant I'd have to go back and ask John Lewis questions that didn't have to do with like the nuts and bolts of history. It had to do with what people like to eat for breakfast. And it had to do with what kinds of jokes people made and what their laugh was like,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I have another question.
All right.
So why did you choose to work on this project specifically? And what were your like biggest challenges and like fears when like starting this process?
I was lucky that somebody stood up and kind of vouched for me at the beginning. So Andrew and John Lewis signed a book deal with my publisher with no artist. And they'd been working on a script for a couple of years. And it was just a normal work day. And I was taking a lunch break, checking the news, and I saw a press release from my publisher about March. And I was like, oh, what a cool idea for a graphic novel. Well, back to work. And I didn't put two and two together that there was no artist listed on the press release, and thus they needed an artist. But like a week later, my publisher called me. He's like, hey man, I strongly suggest that you try out for the role. I'll get you in touch with Congressman Lewis and Andrew. And beyond that, like I was definitely like a little nervous, in the presence of greatness. But the great thing was the person who you see in the news and delivering speeches, like the public John Lewis is really who he is. And he like immediately put me at ease. And I'd say one of the biggest challenges was simply that sense of pressure that I'm telling a very significant part of our national history and of Black history, and recognizing that, you know, like it might not always be the smoothest or the easiest thing to do, but I sort of had to remind myself that ultimately John Lewis chose me to tell his story, like through his eyes, in his words, and kind of remind myself that whatever doubts and anxieties I had, it wasn't about me. It was, my job was to tell his story and tell the history. And that kind of helped put me at ease. Like it was rough drawing a lot of the more violent scenes, and like drawing comics, I'm really used to visual depictions of violence. And so it was interesting because that kind of turned all that on its head. Like these were real acts of violence committed on real people. And so in the process of doing March, it kind of like resensitized me to violence and storytelling. And those were some of the hardest moments to draw, for sure. And it did come back to being like, I've got a job to do, and I've got to tell this history, especially when it's ugly history.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. Does anybody have one more? We have time for like one more question. Does anybody have anything they're dying to find out?
Yeah, I
Anyone?
think I have a quick one
Okay.
more last question.
Go
So I know
ahead.
you had mentioned the Run books. So
Yeah.
what kind of prompted you and the authors to kind of switch from like the title of March over kind of to the title of Run?
Okay, so we were about halfway done drawing March book 3. So it was like the end of 2015, beginning of 2016. And we were basically like, okay, you guys, we need to have a talk about what we're going to do with the next step in John Lewis's story. Is that March book 4? Is it something else? And our conclusion to end March after 3 books was based on the fact that everybody likes trilogies, they work, but also the fact that once you get to the end of March book 3, in John Lewis's words, the passing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 was, in his opinion, the end of the movement as he knew it. And that doesn't mean that the work was over. It doesn't mean that a final victory was won, but that's how he chooses to bookend the civil rights movement. So we had to respect that as his collaborators. And we're like, okay, so March ends with the signing of the Voting Rights Act. Run is also a little different because it really documents his transition from direct action and activism to public service, sort of moving in a direction that will lead him ultimately to Congress. You know, it's also more personal. It's a little darker and more emotional. A lot of it is like the differences and the splits in the civil rights movement start to get really personal and really confusing. And he feels abandoned by some of the people who he has spent years and years working alongside. And the tone of it was different enough that the title Run is not only like run for office, but it also has to do with like parting ways with Snick, parting ways with a lot of the people he had spent years working together with, and kind of feeling like he didn't have a home or a place. And so that tone is so different that we felt it was appropriate to start over with a new title.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have run out of time. Thank you, ladies, for your questions. They were great. And let me see what my plug speech here. A big thank you, of course, to Nate Powell and our awesome team interviewers, Reese, Lila, Hannah, and Caroline. You guys did a great job. And I'd also like to extend a huge thank you to the Glenview Public Library Foundation for their generous support of Glenview Reads Together and the programming involved. If you need to know more about the programs going on or the book discussions, we do have brochures both online and in the library. And thank you everybody for coming today. And thank you, Nate, again for your wonderful tales of your wonderful book, March.
Oh,
Thanks.
thanks a lot. It was a real pleasure, y'all.
Bye-bye now.
See ya.